Remember some years ago, I went and did some teaching in a prison, in a maximum security prison. And I talked to a group of about 30 men, and they were all lifetime prisoners. So you can imagine what you probably had to do to be in prison for the rest of your life with no possibility of being paroled. These were, for the most part, serious, hardened criminals. And yet, just because they were willing to come see me or wanted to come see me talk at the prison, it showed. It was proof that they were beginning to examine their lives in a deeper and more honest and intimate way. And I remember this one gentleman. He looked to me to probably be in his mid-40s or so. And he talked about what a difficult prisoner that he was. He had a life sentence. He would never get out of prison. And he talked about how incredibly angry he had been in his life, and even in his prison life, that he was an extremely angry man and a violent man. And he had been put down into solitary confinement many times in his years as a prisoner. And he talked about the last time that he got put in solitary confinement. And at this prison, solitary confinement was very, very daunting, very grim. It's a very, very small cell with no windows, and you're there all alone and nothing to do, nothing to read, nothing to write with, just to sit in this extremely small room with no windows for hours and hours, weeks after weeks, month after month. He was in this confinement in this very small cell. And he talked about how when he first got put in there, he got put in there for being angry or for acting out. And so they put him in solitary confinement. And he talked about at one point when he was in there, he started to review his life. He'd always been so reactive and so upset and so angry that he never really reviewed his life. But all those days and weeks in solitary confinement with nothing to do began to open him, that something in him began to arise into his consciousness. And he just went through the stories of his life, the events of his life, starting when he was very young up through his life, one after another, after another, after another, after another, after another, and the crimes that he had committed. And since he had multiple life sentences, I probably assumed that he had probably killed someone to get these multiple life sentences. And he talked about being in this solitary confinement and just watching his life unfold in his mind's eye from the time he was very, very young up through his adolescence, up through his adult years, being put in prison up till that point. And he talked about, as he was replaying these stories, these events in his mind's eye over and over and over and over and over again, he had all these different reactions to them. Sometimes he was angry. Sometimes he was angry at somebody. He was angry for his bad childhood. He was angry for the way he had been brought up as a child. He was angry for his lack of opportunities in life, or his perceived lack of opportunities. But as these stories kept playing out in his mind's eye over the weeks, eventually the anger started to subside, and he started to encounter the events of his life in a more and more and more simple way, a way that was not overlaid with emotional reactivity to it. And he said, as these events of his life unfolded, he started to realize that what got him in that prison was a whole series of decisions that he had made, starting from when he was quite young. Decisions that he had no idea where they would lead, what their consequences would be, what kind of life narrative that they would weave together. And yet he was able to see that from a young age, as he was making these decisions about life, about what was fair, about what was not fair, about who should have done what and why. And as he was watching this unfold, he started to realize his own responsibility. Even though he had been mistreated, even though he was raised in far, far from ideal circumstances, even though his options as he grew older seemed to be few, he started to realize that even though all that was true, underneath it all, he was making decisions about how he would act and how he would respond to the difficult events of his life. And he talked about, at some point, being able to see these decisions being made without blaming himself for making the decisions. Again, without the overlay of right or wrong, just seeing what happened, just seeing how his life had woven itself together. And he could finally come to see all the decisions he'd made that led up to exactly where he was, to that precise moment in solitary confinement. Quite unexpectedly, he described this experience of this quality of love that quite unexpectedly started to bloom. He described it as like a pinprick in his chest of light and this feeling of love. And as he was just with himself, with his life, with what had led up to this moment, and the less he judged it, the less he judged others or blamed others, the more this light, this pinprick of love grew. And he described how as he sat there one day, it just grew and grew and grew little by little. And at a certain point, he says it just filled him completely and filled his entire prison cell that he was in, and kept expanding and expanding and expanding and expanding. And, as he was telling the story, I could see this light in his eyes before he even told the story. I could see this radiance, this transparency that got my attention immediately when I walked in the room and was looking around at everyone. Because it is true that the eyes are the doorway to the soul. And he was telling this, he just was in a state of reverie. He was radiant, actually. And at one point, he stood up out of his chair and he looked at all the men, all the prisoners in the room. And he said to them, as he pointed his finger, he said, "I may not like all of you, but he said, I cannot help but to love each and every one of you. Each and every one of you are part of my love." And he said it with such authenticity, with such depth of emotion and meaning. It was extraordinarily moving, not only what he had realized, what he had said, but the context that he'd said it in. In the middle of this maximum security prison with a bunch of hardened criminals. And here he is telling this amazing, amazing story. And as he said, I may not like all of you, but I can't help but to love each and every one of you. And then he sat down in his chair and he said, you know, the irony is that I am infinitely more free in this prison than I ever was outside of it. That he had found infinitely more freedom in that prison, even in that terrible, dark, solitary confinement, than he had ever experienced being outside of the prison.